Hey guys, Morton here. Welcome back to another opening repertoire video. Today we'll be taking a look at the Danish Gambit, which is one of the gambit options you can choose against 1e4, e5. Again, I'll be walking you through all the key ideas and variations that you need to know in order to play this opening, and stick around to the very end and I'll give you my recommendations there as well. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this opening, and otherwise we will jump straight into the video. Okay, so we get into the Danish Gambit after the move 1e4, e5, and then white plays the move pawn to d4. Black captures here, and then white offers the sacrifice of another pawn with the move pawn to c3. You can also play the move queen takes d4, which is also one of my main recommendations, but first we'll take a look at the traditional way of playing it. After the move pawn to c3, pawn takes, and then here we don't capture back. Instead, we offer another sacrifice with the move bishop to c4. Now, black can capture this pawn. He also can decline it by playing other moves such as knight f6, for example, after which you can take the pawn back with your knight, and getting that extra lead in development is going to give you some extra attacking options here with white. Another move that's most common is the move knight to c6, and for example, we can recapture with knight takes c3, knight f6, and play moves such as knight f3, d6. And because of this extra lead in development, we can look at playing a little bit more aggressively here with white, with ideas such as the move knight to g5, going for this f7 pawn. And for example, if knight to e5, we can drop the bishop back and look at playing the move pawn to f4, attacking this knight further in the center. For example, with h6 here, we can counter with the move pawn to f4, and the resulting positions get quite sharp, and I think they're perfectly playable for white. So instead of the move knight to c6, black can capture this pawn as well, which I think is a really good option. After the move bishop takes, black has a couple of different moves here he can go for. I'll show you a couple of different ideas. For example, after the move knight to f6 here, white can follow through with the move knight to f3, and then if bishop check on b4, we have a couple of different ideas. You could play knight c3, you could castle to the king side if you're allowed, and you can even sometimes shuffle the king across to f1 and play with that extra lead in development. For example, if bishop check here, one popular move apart from knight c3 is just to play the move king f1, leading to very unclear positions here. But one of the main lines in this position is definitely to play the move pawn to d5, and after the move pawn to d5, bishop takes. There is a trap here after the move knight f6 where you can play the move knight to c3, and here if black actually captures the bishop, knight takes, and falls into the trap with the move pawn to c6, you can actually play this move knight to f6 check, with the idea that if black captures, then we first trade off queens and then capture this pawn on f6, forking the king and rook. But most of the time in this position, white will play the move bishop takes f7, king takes, and it looks like we win the queen on d8, but actually black will win the material back after this move bishop to b4, leading to a discovered check on our queen. Now we want to save the queen, so the only move is to bring the queen back to d2. After queen takes, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, rook to e8. Here the main line continues with either pawn to f3 or knight to f3. For example, this indirectly defends the pawn because black is unable to capture because we have this move knight to e5 check, and this blocks the defense of the knight and indirectly wins the knight on e4. We can also just play the move pawn to f3 here, where I think white is doing absolutely fine in this endgame, and I don't think there's any problems. But the issue I have with the move pawn to c3 is that most often than not, black will actually decline the sacrifice, as with most gambits, with the move pawn to d5, and this one is a little bit harder to play because you get into some very forced positions after takes, queen takes, pawn takes, knight across, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2 to unblock the pin. Now one really annoying line here you have to deal with is the move bishop to b4, and after the move knight c3, black can capture this knight on f3, forcing us to recapture with the bishop. Now Black can't capture the pawn on d4 because we have this intermezzo bishop takes knight check, and that would pick up the queen, a very typical trap. But after the move queen c4, this leaves us in a very tough position, because in order to get castled, most often we will just have to play queen e2 and trade off queens. For example, here we could play the move bishop takes c6 among several other moves, but after the move bishop takes, black will usually capture back with the pawn in order to prevent us from castling, and the only way to castle is to play queen e2 check and get this queen trade. The endgame is not terrible for us, but it's more or less around equal, and it's something where, I mean, if you're playing the Danish, you probably don't want to get into this type of queenless middle game right off the bat. So you want something a little bit more room for you to play. That's why instead of the move c3 here, I'm actually suggesting a move which isn't played so often, especially not at the lower levels, and that's the move queen takes d4. It looks like we lose a tempo with the move knight c6, but actually after the move queen to e3, things are not so simple for black. White has a lot of relatively easy attacking ideas here, and that's why I fully recommend this opening at any level, actually. Pawn to d6, bishop to d2. So this is one continuation that could happen. For example, black just develops the bishop a little bit more passively here with to e7, just to show you exactly what white can do in these type of positions. Our plan involves most often either marching our pawns up the board with f3, g4, h4, or sometimes we can play the move pawn to f4 and look at marching our pawns this way. So for example here we could play the move, let's say queen g3, knight e5, we could go f4, h4 as in this game, h5, f5, and we can see white's putting a lot of pressure on the king side. And now after pawn takes here, we get the open g file, and white went on to get a very nice attack on the king side, which wasn't that hard to execute. You can also go for a plan involving the move pawn to f3 here, and then for example, let's say bishop to e6, go for this typical kingside pawn advance with the move pawn to g4 and pawn to h4, pawn to h5, pushing your pawns up this way. Very, very straightforward way to attack, but can be incredibly dangerous. So after the move knight to c3 here, one of the main lines for black, the absolute main line, is actually to play the move bishop to b4. After the bishop coming to b4, we play the move bishop to d2, castles, and we will castle to the queen side, again with the plan of pushing on the king side. Rook to e8. Now the main move for white in this position traditionally was the move either queen f4 or queen to g3, but after this move black has a couple of interesting options, such as knight takes e4, or even the move rook takes e4 is very, very interesting for black, and it's something I suggest that we don't go into. Instead, I'm suggesting a move which is relatively rare. It's not played that often, but I think it offers much better practical chances, and that is the move bishop to c4 in this particular position. So it's definitely less common option here. After the move bishop c4, the idea is that if black goes for the knight on c3 and captures the pawn, then things can get incredibly dangerous. For example, he can't take with the rook because we just take the knight and that would pick up a free piece. So instead he should capture back with the knight, but in this position after the move queen to f4, there's a lot of problems for black in this position, especially these bishops are very, very strong. And let's say black plays the move knight g5, can be met by knight f3 with already very dangerous pressure on the king side for just one sacrificed pawn. And if knight f6, then again we play the move knight to f3 with a lot of pressure coming on the king side. For example, d6, we can follow through with knight g5, and let's say bishop to e6 is met by bishop to d3. We want to keep some pieces on the board, And for example, h6 here is met by a very dangerous pawn to h4. So a very typical idea involving the fishing pole, where if black captures the knight, we capture back, opening up this h file for our pieces to attack with. So that's my recommendation there. Now if black plays d6, we can do a very similar idea here as white. We can play either knight f3, well we can play knight h3, you can play even pawn to f3 is a good option here for white. I'm going to suggest to move knight to f3 here, and for example here there was a couple of games. One game went bishop to c5, white played the move queen to f4, and after the move bishop to e6, bishop takes, rook takes, knight to g5, rook to e8, knight to d5, h6, and then again the move pawn to h4. Things are getting quite dangerous for black. He can defend maybe with very accurate play, but white has a lot of pressure coming up here, and it's relatively easy for white to execute this attack. Instead, after the move bishop to e6 here, again we can keep pieces on the board. We don't necessarily have to exchange pieces off, but if you do want to exchange pieces off, you can as well with the same sort of ideas. You know, pawn going to h4. Again, we're defending our pawn here with f3 and then looking for a kingside attack. So just to show you that black can't in fact take this knight, if he takes it, we take back, and then we play the move pawn to f4. And as soon as we get two pieces along this h file, things get very dangerous for black. So he wants to be careful of doing that. So instead, after the move bishop to d3, bishop to c5, queen to e2, this is another variation that could take place. Let's say bishop to e3, bishop to b4, knight to d5. Again, we can sacrifice this pawn on e4, and we have a lot of play here for white after, say, the move queen to b5. But I think overall this line is relatively easy to play for white, and it does give you, I think, better chances than the traditional way of playing with pawn to c3. So I think starting out with pawn to c3 at the lower levels is really good, but then as you progress upwards, you'll find that it's a little bit harder to play, and your opponents may be able to refute it a little bit better, in which case it may be worth considering to switch to the queen takes d4 variations. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any feedback, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next video.